Hello everyone, and as they say here in Israel, shalom to all of you. We are in Israel. This is Jerusalem behind me, the city walls of Jerusalem that you can see. And we are here for a special episode of the India Story. Every once in a while, the India Story will travel out to some of India's key partners, key allies, countries that are particularly important for the India Story now and the future. And Israel, very much a country that is central to India's view on the world right now. Why do I say this? After all, was it just 30 or 35 years ago, you couldn't even travel to Israel. As an Indian citizen, you weren't allowed to come here. There were no diplomatic relations. And then diplomatic relations were established. And then after that, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, those relations have become close and closer and even closer to the point of that they're now strategic allies that extend in a number of regions. They extend in the field of defense, they extend the field of economy, they extend particularly in high-tech, and high-tech in areas like the internet, high-tech in cybersecurity, and high-tech in clean energy and agriculture. Drip irrigation, those sort of areas where Israel is very strong are places where the partnership is happening. And I'm going to be talking to you about that over the next half an hour. The India-Israel partnership, how Israel can play a role in taking the India story forward, and what are some of the concerns that we have to keep in mind. The two countries have had an interesting history, which I'm going to touch upon. But when you look at the present, I think it's important and interesting to see the similarities that exist in many, many areas. Similarities, you'll say, have you gone completely crazy? Because at the end of the day, Israel, a tiny little country, which is actually smaller than the state of Meghalaya. Yeah, that's how small Israel is. 9 million people. And then you got India with 1.4 billion people. But when you look past all of that, I think there are important lessons that both countries have to learn, perhaps from each other. The question of diversity, the question of how do you coexist in a multicultural, multi-ethnic sort of a country, what are the rules and regulations there should be. And as we are seeing just today, on Wednesday, with the protests that are taking place in Israel, this is not a settled matter by any stretch of imagination in Israel any more than it is in India. You've seen these giant protests, and I'm playing some of the pictures for you, of people who are complaining and protesting about judicial reforms that are happening in Israel. The question of how much of a control the parliament should have over the judiciary or vice versa. Who should select the judges? Does any of that sound familiar to you? Yes, of course. We've been hearing this debate taking place in India for a really long period. So some of the questions about how do you build a society are very common. Then it comes to what sort of an economy should you build? And again, there are similarities between the two countries. Israel, by nature, Israelis tend to be argumentative. They have a tradition of being able to push back. They're not a very regimented society. Again, does that sound familiar? Very similar to India. And in this sort of a chaos, sometimes high-tech industries thrive and they do really well. We're seeing this happening in Israel. Israel is a startup nation, is one of the hubs of high-tech everywhere in the world. And we're starting to see that in India as well. And then there are other similarities. Countries surrounded by hostile neighbors on all sides. What does that do to you? What are the defense relations and ties that we need to build up? And it's no surprise that defense has been at the core of the India-Israel partnership for a long period of time. Secretly at first, and then later. So a number of areas for the two countries to really think about as we go forward, and all those partnerships will have to be built. India has found in Israel a partner and an ally right now, and Israel, a country that sometimes does feel surrounded by enemies on all sides, and these days is once again facing a lot of hostile press in a lot of directions, does look east increasingly often and look at India and see a possible partner and a friend and an ally out there. And that's been underlined by some of the latest developments that are now happening, such as I2U2, which is India, Israel, US and UAE, partnerships that are being built after the Abraham Accords. Well, before we analyze all of this with the ambassador or anybody else, here's a look at the history of India-Israel relations.
India and Israel today enjoy strong bilateral ties that include extensive and comprehensive economic, military and political relations. But it wasn't always so. In fact, India voted against the partition of Palestine to create the Jewish state in 1947, a controversial partition that led to a lot of violence immediately after. Violence which continues between the states of Israel and Palestine in modern times. India also voted against Israel's admission to the United Nations in 1949. In 1950, however, India officially recognized the state of Israel, with Prime Minister Nehru stating that Israel is a fact. Despite India allowing Israel to open a consulate in what was then the city of Bombay, now Mumbai, in 1953 a full diplomatic relationship was not established between the two countries and relations remained relatively informal. Despite Israel's support to India during the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971, which saw the country even secretly supply arms to India, full diplomatic relations with Israel were not established until the early 1990s. India formally established relations with Israel when it established an embassy in Tel Aviv in January 1992. Since then, ties between the two countries have flourished due to common strategic interests. Defense and agriculture have formed the two main pillars of the bilateral ties. Although in recent years, relations have seen growth in a broad spectrum of areas. Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Israel in 2017, becoming the first Indian PM to do so, and signed 7 memorandums of understanding across fields like innovation, technology, space, and science. More agreements were signed the following year. In 2018, when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited India, from bilateral trade of around $200 million in 1992, trade between India and Israel stands at $7.86 billion in 2021-2022. India is Israel's second largest trading partner in Asia and the 9th largest globally. Though bilateral trade is dominated mainly by diamonds and chemicals, both countries envision a strong technology-based partnership in the future, befitting two knowledge economies. Defense, however, remains one of the top areas of collaboration between the two countries. India is the largest buyer of Israel's military equipment, and Israel is the second largest supplier of arms to India after Russia. Strategic ties between the two countries extend to intelligence sharing focused on combating terror groups and joint military training exercises. In 2021, marking another cornerstone in deepening relations, India and Israel joined the United States and the UAE to form the I2U2 bloc, to deepen technological and private sector collaboration in the region and tackle transnational challenges in 6 focus areas. The formation of this bloc favors India's foreign policy goals of pragmatic multilateral cooperation. Although the current disposition in Israel is attracting some controversy, diplomatic and economic ties with India continue to be strong. On February 22nd, Israeli Ambassador Naor Gilon said that Israel's handing over of the strategically important Haifa port to the Adani Group is a reflection of the trust that Israel has on India. The two countries have also been in negotiations over a free trade agreement which has been in the works for a while. However, the ambassador indicated that there could be movement on that front when Benjamin Netanyahu visits India later this year.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.